we're about to go on a grand tangent. I've had some food poisoning in the last over 24 hours, and my head is banging, but my soul is screaming with information that I would like to share with the world. So, when it comes down to the sexual perversion and exploitation of children being normalized in our country, the history is there. You can find the history. I realize that giving all of the information in, like, hey, read this book, it can be a lot for people, but they're not too far gone to scroll by and listen to somebody talk about it. So that's where we're going to go with this. I'm going to create a whole reel that is on Kinsey, Crime and Consequences, the book by Judith A. Reisman, PhD. And you're probably going to be horrified. And that's just the way it is. If you don't know your threats, how do you mitigate them? If you don't know what they are, how do you not have them? Kinsey, Crimes and Consequences, the second edition. The Red Queen and the Grand Scheme. In 1948, the Institute for Sex Research at Indiana University was led by eugenicist Alfred C. Kinsey, whose sex research shook America's moral foundations and launched the 1960s sexual revolution. 50 years later, new revelations confirm Dr. Judith Reisman's 1981 exposure of scientific fraud and criminally derived data contained in the publicly funded Kinsey reports. Dr. Reisman revealed that Kinsey conducted human experiments in a soundproof laboratory built to his specifications at Indiana University, and that the sexual abuse of at least 317 infants and young boys was a scientific protocol for Kinsey's 1948 report. Okay. So, Dr. Reisman discloses for the first time the ongoing consequences to the American people and the world based on Kinsey's deliberately skewed research. Kinsey died in 1956, but his institute endures today under the expanded title of the Kinsey Institute for Research in Sex, Gender, and Reproduction, suggesting an even more ominous threat to human rights and liberty. So, that's where we're going to go. That's what I'm going to be getting you guys information on. It is intense. We will continue on in just a moment. I'm very excited to jump into this one. The book begins with Judith Reisman's personal odyssey, talking about how she would like to introduce herself before she introduces Kinsey and the pedophiles, and comes out with this just a beautiful writing of where she's from, her family background, and how she came to be involved in international scholarly conventions, federally funded investigations, the FBI, Joint Chiefs, national and international governmental hearings on fraud, child sexual abuse, juvenile delinquency, rape, and sex, pornography, drugs, and critical moral issues of that time. So her last name was Gelernter, and it means the learned one. And your life should be in honor of your name. So I think that is absolutely beautiful. She says she also inherited the love of truth, concern for the powerless, and the resistance of tyranny from her parents. She lived at a wonderful time. So it's super cool how Judith Reisman goes through and she introduces herself in her own personal odyssey. She comes to be involved with international scholarly conventions, federally funded investigations, the FBI, the Joint Chiefs, national and international governmental hearings on science fraud, child sexual abuse, juvenile delinquency, rape and sexual crime, pornography, drugs, and other critical social and moral issues of our time. So knowing something, it aids to us incredibly. I love that she goes through and notes that her last name at the time, Gerlinter, means the learned one, that your life should be in honor of your name. And that's so who Judith Reisman was. I love also that she says that she inherited from her parents a love for truth, a concern for the powerless, and a resistance of tyranny. So you can kind of see a great pattern in her life, and really find a trusting woman with information. She goes on to talk about how she lived in a wonderful time, and that her mother was there for her when she'd come home, and her father was super supportive of everything she wanted to do. She felt safe with her neighbors. She had a hedge of protection around her life, essentially. So she says that was not breached until 1966 when her 10-year-old daughter was molested by a 13-year-old adored and trusted family friend. She told him to stop, but he persisted. He knew that she would like it, he said. He knew from his father's glossy magazines that only acceptable pornography of that time was the only one. The boy left the country a few weeks later after it came to light that my daughter was but one of the several neighborhood children that he had raped, including his own little brother. My heart was broken for all the families involved. This appalling event in our lives, I would learn later, was a pattern with juvenile sex offenders, as they were known in law enforcement circles. Over the years, that pattern would spread like an infectious disease. So, she says, I might have never known anything about her violation except that my daughter slipped into a deep depression. Only after I promised not to call the police would she talk about what happened. After assuring her that this was not her fault, I called my dependable state aunt, who listened sympathetically and declared, well, Judy, she may have been looking for this herself. Children are sexual from birth. Stunned, I replied that my child was not seeking sex, and I dialed my Berkeley school chum, Carol, who's still seeking confirmation of my righteous indignation at my daughter's violation, which I badly needed to hear. Instead, Carol counseled, well, Judy, she may have been looking for this herself. You know children are sexual from birth. I wondered at the same why two such people geographically, she had entered a world according to Kinsey. I'm telling you guys, this stuff's deep. It runs so deep. I would hear that children were sexual from birth again, but the next time I would learn that the hidden circumstances surrounding it is its source. So in the 70s, Judith Reisman was a segment producer for CBS, Captain Kangaroo. She made a bunch of Scholastic magazine, educational music stuff for different different histories for different museums, Milwaukee, Cleveland, Skirball, and Los Angeles. Anyway, what happens is that she is called into the office and she's talked to about the hidden cameras that are used to study the children's eye movement, and is told that they need to speed up her tempo to compete with the fast action and increasing violence of the cartoons on other stations. So she finds herself unwilling to do this because she can see what's being influenced, reconfigured, and actually changed in the child's brain. The other exciting stimuli daily altered the very structure of the receiving child's brain from what they were doing in changing things. So changing things on the screen. She says that my museum and artwork and my television experience left me worried about the way children were being influenced, reconfigured, actually changed, as images and other exciting stimuli daily altered the very structure of the receiving child's brain, just like I have just said. If a prestigious and responsible program like Captain Kangaroo had to speed up its formats in the days of Leave It to Beaver, what would happen in decades to come? What kind of children was television fashioning, and how would these altered children's minds of our institutions of education, theology, government, law, medicine, family, and mass media itself? So she goes back to school to get another degree studying mass media effects. Judith Reisman is the bomb. There's no way around it, okay? Can we all agree? So she becomes a mass media professional, basically. 1972, television toxicity has been well documented in the Surgeon General's report on television violence. By ignoring the report's hard findings, not reporting the facts, the mass media successfully discounted and concealed the toxic fallout of its own profession. That there was already an existing but ignored body of research on television's potential harm caused the focus of her graduate work to shift, especially after she witnessed what could be called worrisome, unmonitored experiment in verbal versus nonverbal behavior. So she's about to really dive into some deep areas. It's touching on Playboy, it's touching on Penthouse, it's touching on Hustler. These are things that everybody says like, oh, these are totally normal and cool, and they're not, for big reasons. Okay, so Judith Reisman gets really into what's wreaking havoc in delicate relationships between husbands and wives. She thought that she has daughters, so she would like to see them married to well-adjusted men. She had no notion of the role of Alfred Kinsey in pornography, or how exactly hard or softcore porn was related to sexual abuse to children. She said she had no idea how bad the problem was or how deeply I would become involved in the attempt to solve it. However, I already could see the evidence of how the cultural acceptance of pornography's view of sex was increasing rates of divorce and sexual disorder. We're about to jump into some crazy stuff just about now. Prepare your brains. Her next turning point comes in 1977 when she was in Wales to deliver a research paper on women and pornography at the British Psychological Association International Convention. She heard Tom O'Carroll, the leader of the Pedophile Information Exchange, PIE, had been blanketing England on a public relations tour promoting sex with children on his way to speak at the conference she was at. All of England was in an uproar over the daily press reports describing the aims of PIE and O'Carroll. It was reported that PIE specialized in providing specific lists of places where pedophiles could locate and seduce children. There is an entire tour of this in 1977, and you know it's before and you know it's after. So he goes to speak at the college podium. The staff goes on strike. For good reason. I can picture this whole thing going down. Whole thing. So this guy from PIE is advocating for places to seduce children while Judith shows up with ways that pornography harms women and children, right? So she brought 80 slides for her presentation as evidence supporting her findings of child pornography in Playboy and Penthouse. I had already clashed with the American Professor Larry Constantine, a Penthouse board member advocating child pornography in his paper, The Sexual Rights of Children. So when Constantine set out on a harried bulletin for a meeting of conference speakers, I hastened to join the group, she says. It's free speech. Petition demanding that PIE's O'Carroll speak and that our beds be made. I urged the group to reconsider. We were guests here and would leave in a few days, I reasoned. What right we had to leave behind a community undone, prioritizing child molesters. So, the O'Carroll, he whisks safely out of Wales. Judith Reisman was the only one who did not sign the petition for him to speak. She didn't want to hear it because it was disgusting, obviously. So, she saw this as a very legitimate public concern for children's safety. O'Carroll was whisked away out of Wales. I was leaving for London on the train when a Canadian psychologist took me quietly aside. Certainly I was right, he said. The images I screened of children in Playboy and Penthouse would cause harmful sexual acting out on children. But if I was looking for the cause, he directed me not to the neglect reading about Kinsey in The Sexual Researchers by Edward Brecker. Why? I asked. He says, I worked with Kinsey and Pomeroy, he said. One is a pedophile and the other is a homosexual. Which is which, I asked. Read and discover, he replied. And I tell you what, it is absurdly disgusting. So at this point, Judith Reisman has firsthand knowledge of somebody who was working with Kinsey and Pomeroy and is saying, like, go check it out. Like, you have just seen only a little bit. Go, go, go. So she ends up going back home and she is reading from the source to view exactly. But nowhere was there any mention of child abuse data. She's studying sexual behavior in the human male. Page 80, table 34. You've probably heard of table 34. If you haven't, your mind is about to explode because table 34 is absolutely appalling. There are hundreds of positive articles about this guy, and all the sexual abuse is there, recorded for your viewing in these tables. It's absurd. It's absurd. So, continuing on. This is table 34. This is the age of child on this side. This is the number of orgasms, the time involved. There's a lot going on here. Number of orgasms in a 2-year-old, 11 for 65 minutes. You've got a 24-hour period for a 4-year-old. 17 orgasms. Are you crazy? So you can see why that table would come into question. That's not normal. That's not okay. Hundreds of positive articles about this man, right? While in the background, these are his tables. Nowhere were there any criticisms of these tables and graphs. So she was beginning to accept the fact that thousands of international scientists who studied Kinsey never saw this right before their very eyes. Like, they couldn't see that wasn't abnormal or disgusting. So she writes to the Kinsey Institute from Kinsey's co-author, and she receives a reply from Paul Gebhard, which he is a crazy person if you've seen any of the interviews. He defends the tables, that they were obtained from parents, school teachers, and male homosexuals, and that some of Kinsey's men used manual and oral techniques to catalog how many orgasms infant and children could produce in any amount of time. So it continues to get even worse, y'all. She brings in this information, right? She is a Fifth World Congress of Sexology. She lectured on Dr. Kinsey and his child data. She was confident in her colleagues that they would be outraged by these tables, right? Perhaps worst of all for me as a scholar and a mother were pages 160 and 161, where Kinsey claimed his data came from interviews, quote unquote. How could he say that 196 little children, some as young as 2 months old, enjoyed, quotes, fainting, screaming, weeping, and convulsing? How could he say that these children's response was evidence of their sexual pleasure and climax? I called it evidence of terror, of pain, as well as criminal. One of us was very, very sexually mixed up. These are based on real events of our history that's being taught to our nation's children. So she goes on to share this information with, oh my gosh, she had this big paper titled "The Scientist as a Contributed Agent to Child Sexual Abuse, a Preliminary Consideration of Possible Ethics Violations." It had been released in the abstracts, and the result was no less than she expected. Standing in a standing room only session, I was gratified that so many people were as concerned as I was. After screening my slides of tables 30 to 34, which Kinsey's report the rates and speeds of orgasms of at least 317 infants and children. Again, the youngest were merely 2 months old. I rested my case and looked out over the audience. The room was totally silent. Finally, a tall, blonde Nordic type who had been standing near the podium stepped forward and fairly shouted to the audience. Here's what she's about to yell. She yells, "I am a Swedish reporter and I have never spoken out at a conference. That is not my role, but what is the matter with all of you? This woman has just dropped an atomic bomb in this very room and you have nothing to ask, nothing to say?" That broke the ice, and the hands shot up. Although a Kinsey Institute representative protested that none of this was true, and the comments of those in attendance were limited by the conference mediator, oh my gosh, this must have been an amazing space. Like, I would have loved to have taken up space in this room while this was happening. This is world-changing information. She was shocked that the children were used without consent. However, she hastened to assure me that children would be sexually stimulated by adults, even parents. They were for therapeutic reasons, strictly, of course. Wow. Wow, 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 wow.